Thank you, Juliana. That was great. Now, my voice is going to be a little bit weak. I'm overcoming a cold, but hopefully you can hear me okay. Hear me? Okay, great. Really, thanks for that introduction, and I am pleased with the affection of being referred to as T. Haas now for almost 6 years, and it came from the students. And but truth be told, now my wife is even calling me that. So, but really great to have that brief introduction. But really, what I'm here for is to introduce one of Michigan's leaders, and I say that in the truest sense of that word. Andy Dillon, the 44th treasurer, but I'm going to go back to the first two times that I met the speaker. First time was actually, I don't know if he'll remember this, but we were at the on the Grand Rapids campus, the Voss Center, and Mark Murray brought in together a number of business leaders, and this was in the Meyer Regency room, and we're sitting around, and I'm there as well, and we had a chance to visit about the needs of business. You were almost brand new speaker at the time, I believe, and Mark was able to bring together these business leaders from West Michigan to share some thoughts and perspectives. And at that point in time, we were also talking about the need for talent, the need for economic development. And the speaker was very, very clear in one regard. He was listening. He was listening to the business leaders. He was listening to others around that table. I think primarily because he wanted to represent, he wanted to do the best job he could as the speaker. Well, fast forward then, 2 weeks later, I was chairing the President's Council State for the universities, the public universities, and the speaker came in. That was the second time we met, sir. And you came in, and again, he wanted to hear from us. We were we were an asset, in his words, to Michigan. We were an asset. So you tie in the business perspective and then the higher educational perspective. And what he was doing was trying to establish himself as the speaker who then could take in these types of data points and do the best job he could for the state of Michigan. Not for himself, not for a party, but for the state of Michigan as the role he had with Speaker of the House. And that I am very, very pleased to share with you just that little insight that I had. And then since then, Andy, you and I have had numerous conversations since then. And I know that he's very clear in understanding that we have a variety of assets here in the state and that we all need then to work together in a very, very collaborative way. Andy's a graduate of University of Notre Dame. He has degrees in accounting and in law. Before he came into a public office, he was a practicing lawyer and also a business person, managing director of Winchurch Capital and VP of GE Capital. He then moved into public service with his leadership that he wanted to use in service to the state of Michigan, serving 3 terms with the House of Representatives, 2 terms as Speaker of the House. And in that role as Speaker of the House, he can look back, I think, with a notion of legacy with his work towards energy reform and the chief architect of the 21st Century Jobs Fund, created to diversify Michigan's economy. Again, looking ahead to what was needed for our state. As you know, he ran for governor, and during that time, though, you could also come back to the notion of what he wanted to do. He wanted to not divide, but to pull together our state after the past years that we had, especially looking at the engagement of governor, of the Senate, and of the House, trying to pull that all together. Well, what happened then, of course, Governor Snyder came into office, and the first appointment was to go to Andy Dillon. And again, I think it shows very clearly that Governor Snyder could see the type of individual that Andy was to the rest of the state. The nature of collaboration, the nature of someone who is going to listen someone who is then going to help make the decisions that were going to be in the best interest of the state of Michigan. Well, I think that it's very appropriate that we have an individual who might be a Democrat working with a Republican, working collaboratively. I dare say Washington should take note, without a doubt, that this type of nature of a relationship is developed by leadership and by service and by the need for a state to move into a newer sense of itself. And I do know that I am so pleased to introduce a friend, a colleague, and a Michigan leader, Andy Dillon. Speaker.
Well, good afternoon. It's a privilege to be here. I'll tell you, this was a difficult speech to write because it's hard to write about leadership without kind of looking like you're talking about what you've done. So the first little bit I want to talk about is things I've learned, not that I'm necessarily good at, but things I've learned in the roles that I've played in life. And I'll admit on some of the ones I'm weak on. And then I'll move into I've had some pretty unique opportunities in the past few years, and I'll talk about the difference, the leadership challenges presented in those different roles, and then we could open it up to some Q&A. But I love the comment you made at the very beginning, which is this is a room full of leaders. And you don't have to be a CEO or a speaker or a governor to be a leader. Leadership can take place in the home. It can take place in church, in the community. And even at a job where you're in lower middle management, the example you set and what you do in that role can be really powerful leadership, and in some ways far more powerful than what the CEO may be doing. So I think the definition of leadership has to be broad. And I have had, luckily, a pretty diverse career, both in the private sector and the public sector, and it really gives me a foundation that makes me confident in decision making. But at lunchtime, I spoke briefly that I've learned something that's a little odd, and that is that your gut, for the most part, is leading you in the right direction. And I know when I was young, I was very ambitious, and I wanted to do 10 things, not one. I struggled with picking a major. I remember I raced through law school in 2.5 years because I was so anxious to get into the private sector and be involved. And I remember a good friend of mine, his father, told me, don't forget to take time to smell the roses. And I didn't listen to him. I raced through law school instead. While you're in college or in grad school, smell the roses. And I look back, and I maybe made a mistake. I had gotten a scholarship to undergrad, and to me it was all about scheduling the easiest schedule I could get that wouldn't interfere with my life. And I look back now and I think, my God, I was opened up to this whole world of learning, and I was more focused on a social life. And if I could go back, boy, I would take on classes that didn't have an easy professor. I'd take on one that would have taught me something. So this is somewhat by accident. And this morning, the speech would be a lot better if I kicked this book yesterday. But as I was leaving my bedroom this morning, I kicked a book called Leadership, and it was written by Giuliani. And I flipped through it. But as I was kind of preparing my comments for today, I had spent the last 5 or 6 days just typing into my iPad thoughts and ideas I had that are things I learned or observed. And it turns out there's 10 of them. So this doesn't come from David Letterman, but there's 10 things that I think I've learned that influence and impact leadership. And some of them apply to the roles that we don't put into a CEO or a president of an organization. Some of them just apply to everyday life. But number one is that your leadership role has to match your personality. You can't find yourself in a role of leadership and then change who you are. The people won't follow you. If they don't kind of trust that you got a core value there, that you're being straight with them, it's really hard for them to trust, because oftentimes you have to trust your leader on certain instances. So it's got to be who you are. And I remember reading a book a long time ago about FDR's leadership style. And basically, FDR was a horrific manager of people. It was chaos. And I actually had a boss that had a very similar style. I mean, he would flip from one day to the next. You never knew if he'd be, standing behind you. But he was very successful, and it worked out for him. And I saw him successful in 2 different organizations. And I'm trying to rack my brain as to how could that formula work. And the only thing I can come to is that you got your employees so much on their toes, and they're constantly spinning. Am I going to get backstabbed over this? Or, what's the story going to be like tomorrow? That maybe it brings something out in employees that is unique. But I can tell you, I wouldn't trust that as a method to take if you're getting yourself into a leadership position. And if you do, you better study it up and find out why FDR was able to move a big agenda, or why my buddy somehow figured it out. I had the privilege of working at GE Capital, which, as you know, at the time was, it's a subsidiary of GE. And one of the best CEOs in the country is Jack Welch. And it was amazing. I was one of 2 people in my division sitting in Bloomfield Hills. And I could tell you, sitting in my office, I knew what Jack Welch's vision for the company was. I just knew it. I knew what I was supposed to do. He had a great way of overseeing probably 50,000 employees and setting a vision for that operation, and that's why he was so successful. And our own governor is very similar. This governor is very thoughtful, he's very prepared, he's very disciplined. So I view those two, you see the governor doing something in government people don't like usually to do, and that is to measure yourself. And you got to be held accountable if you put out those dashboards, and our governor's not afraid of that. But he knows that if you don't measure things, you can't fix it. So to be a leader, you've got to have, you got to match your personality style, but also you've got to put some work into it. And that goes to the obvious one of integrity and values. And I think if you don't have those, or if your leader doesn't, it's kind of hard to trust and follow. And I was lucky. I think one of the biggest life experiences I had as a kid, I was a freshman in high school at Catholic Central High School. And they had a drive, a raffle drive, that we would get the week off and go sell tickets. And I was in Father Donaher's religion class, and he always led, the amount of money collected from his classroom. And I'll never forget it. We would sell these books, and you could sell them for $10 a book, but he encouraged us to sell them for $2.50 because as a student, you could pocket the $2.50 and then turn in the $10 to the school. So I went traipsing down to this law office where my dad had some friends that worked, and my brother had been selling tickets to them for the prior 10 years. And I go in there and I try to sell the books for $12.50. And they all know it's $10 because they've been buying them for $10 for 10 years. And I left there so humiliated, thinking that my character was in question. I mean, I got kind of the direction from the priest, but it was accidental. But it really hurt me emotionally. I mean, it was something that I thought, I don't want people ever to not trust my character. And that was a life lesson learned at 13 that I carry with me to this day. Because I don't mind disagreeing with someone, but I want them to think I was honest and straight with them. You have to be, unfortunately, willing not to be popular. You might have to advance some causes that are going to upset some people. And there's probably no greater environment for making people upset than when you're the speaker, because there's so many issues that inflame people and they have much different views that when you pick and choose what bills are going to move, you got to be prepared to be unpopular. I did that with being a pro-life Democrat and with taking on public sector unions, talking about one public employee health care plan. I mean, I knew it wasn't going to be popular, but it would save $1 billion when the state's in fiscal stress. So that's just an aspect of leadership. The other one is that you have to have enough expertise to lead. You got to study, you got to read. And when I was a young lawyer, I remember being kind of nervous about, there's so many pieces about being a lawyer. There's the legal drafting, there's this unknown thing about a jury and a judge and what the clients want. I was a very uneasy, not forceful decision maker as a lawyer because I felt I knew so little. And then contrast to that, when I became the speaker, boy, I had a lot of just self-confidence because I had had so many different roles. I'd practiced law, I'd worked in a private equity fund, I'd worked in a turnaround firm, I was a lender, I worked for Bill Bradley, practiced law for 7 years. And I just felt very sure of myself when I got into that role because serving in the legislature suited me well because it's about policy, which I love to think through, and about how to change things. But expertise is important, and reading and keeping fresh on other thoughts that are out there in the world are important. Obviously, you have to have vision. Folks got to have something to chase after. And at the night of the State of the State, it was interesting. It was just a very emotional minute for me where I saw this governor up there presenting, and he introduced his family. And think about it. 2 years before, he probably went to his wife and his kids and said, I'm going to run for governor. And they probably thought, you're crazy. No one knows you. You have no political background. How could you do this? And then in less than 2 years, here he is standing up at the podium as our governor, sharing his vision and values to the state. So you got to take some risks, but you got to have that vision. This one, I'll admit a weakness here, and I picked this up from Giuliani's book, but prepare relentlessly. And if I have a weakness, it'd be that, which I am religious about a to-do list, because I'm always worried that you get sucked into the weeds and you really forget about those 3 or 4 things that you got to get accomplished as a leader in the roles that I was in. So I keep a to-do list, and I hire my weakness. If I'm not good at details and being overly prepared, then I hire people that are. Just understand your weakness. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's not the big idea that kills or fails or was a bad idea. It's always the details that kill you. If you don't get all the details lined up, you can have the best idea in the world, but it's just not going to ever materialize. I go back to hiring smart people. Don't be afraid to hire people smarter than you, and try to hire your weakness so that they can fill in the gaps that you have. I used to think that the vision statements and mission statements that corporate organizations put together were kind of fluffy and maybe a waste of time. They're not. Your organization has to have kind of a compass. So spend time on the big vision mission thing. Put it in place. Don't do it yourself. Get input from the organization about where your values are, because if they're shared values, the culture in the organization will work better. Kick around ideas with people you trust. You don't have to come up with all the ideas, and don't fall into that trap, not invented here. I love sitting around the table in the speaker's office with some of the best minds that served with me and kicked around ideas and strategized, how do you tackle this issue? How do you get through this problem? And more times than not, my opinions were changed by the input that came from around the table. So embrace that. And then don't waver after a decision is made. The thing that I see that paralyzes organizations the most is the inability to make a decision. That doesn't mean that if you made a mistake, you don't fix it. But I'm a big believer that a bad decision is less damaging to an organization than indecision. And I've seen it firsthand. In that turnaround, the guy I worked for came to Michigan with $30 million in his pocket, and today doesn't have any. And we had 10 different things going at once, but he could never pull the trigger on one deal. So it didn't work out for him, and it's terrible. We look at our local units of government, been kicking the cans down the road year after year to now that they're insolvent. And look at General Motors. General Motors knew that they had this big unsustainable healthcare cost and wage burden, but never did anything to change it. So be decisive. So with that, I'll try to move on a little faster than I planned here. But to just walk through 4 little experiences I had where leadership played a role in my life. The first one was the 21st Century Jobs Plan. I was in the minority and had no power and no leadership role. The governor announces this big new initiative, and I had a background in it, so I asked, hey, can I read it? And I had a different way about going about it, and this is where I just injected myself into a role that I really wasn't entitled to, sitting in the minority first year. I was in office for 3 months. But I went to the governor and said, look, I have a background in this. What do you think if I go to the Republicans and make it bipartisan? She gave me permission to do that, and I reached out to Bill Huizenga, and lo and behold, something that was needed in the state got done. It wasn't because I was in a position of leadership. It was just I took the initiative on something that interested me. Becoming speaker is an interesting role, and it's a kind of pretty big operation. It's over $40 million budget, over 500 employees. There's the legislative side, and where I focused most of my energy, I had good people in place to run the House. So the business side, I didn't distract myself with too much. But it's a very stressful experience serving in the legislature. Literally, people cry and fight. Because you're dealing with some really powerful issues. So one thing I tried to manage as best I could was to keep the stress level down. And when we finally moved a bill, that it wasn't so stressful. And believe me, I moved a lot of bills that had me in hot water. I bet I moved 10 to 20 bills with 15 Democratic votes and the rest Republican, which doesn't make you popular when you walk in your caucus. But things had to get done. And because I didn't jam it down people's throat, I gave them input and time. We got it done with as little stress as possible. I feel a personal failure in the inability of Bishop and Granholm and I to get our budgets done on time. It was a very painful process. The legislature tends to act slowly, but not that slowly. So that was terrible. The press, my experience with the press, and even from my minority days is don't be a media hound, because when you really want them to cover something, if they think that you run to the media all the time, they won't really cover the story. So I was kind of a reluctant person with the media for most of my career, and I think it paid me dividends. When I really wanted to get something covered, the writers usually agreed that, you know, I'll pay attention to Dillon. The other big thing I did is after I became speaker, I found out, you know, over 65% of our dollars came from the same people, special interests. And I'm like, I can't be the speaker when I'm beholden to very few special interests. So I went out on a mission to raise another $2 million from non-traditional sources. And I told folks, I said, I won't give you all the details, but I told them if I don't raise a minimum of $1.5 million, you're not buying what I want to buy here. So first guy wrote a nice check and said, come back to me when you get your minimum. I never had to go back to him because I had raised $2.5 million on smaller increments. But it gave me the ability to run the house the way I wanted to, where I couldn't have people that disagreed with me say, we funded every one of your campaigns. I could say, no, you didn't. I diversified. Unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to continue, but I think that's a problem shared by both sides of the aisle. The race for governor, and I'll try to wrap up quickly here. It was fun because I had a chance. The reason I ran for governor, and I waited too long to get in, but I ran because I thought Michigan was fixable. And it turns out that Snyder's agenda and mine really weren't that much different. So the role of running for governor was cool in that I could go to a place like this and share my vision about the state and how you fix it. Where I tripped up as a leader is I got started too late. I didn't want to be running while we were dealing with the budget. And I never built, you know, I had some weaknesses in the machinery part of a campaign. You know, the candidate's supposed to be out with the public and sharing the vision and doing TV and raising money, and then the campaign should run itself. And I never got the right components in place to have that thing run as well. It didn't affect the outcome of the election, but we had some hiccups we never should have. And I remember during the process where I was supposed to not preoccupy myself with those details too much, my gut told me some wrong decisions were being made. Not major stuff, and I let it go. But, you know, I look back and I say, you know, I should have injected myself more than I did. As Treasury, so that's, well, I guess I lose the race for governor. I lose in the primary. And the rule in politics, if you're going to lose in the primary. So that was a good thing. And everyone's running for re-election in the fall, and I'm sitting on the couch watching CNBC every day, trying to get a sense of the markets, what was going on in the financial world. And the governor calls and asks if I would take this job. And I was ready to go to the private sector and actually said no for about 2 weeks. But a good friend of mine convinced me that this was an interesting opportunity and that I should take it. And so I called him back and reconsidered. And it's a fantastic opportunity. Treasury has about 1,500 employees, $2.5 billion budget. We process 10 million transactions a year. It's a big operation. And a year and a half ago, no one would have said that I'd spend as treasurer 70% of my time, if not more, working with troubled units of government. But that is the lion's share of what I do. And when I look at this operation, I've got a really good management team. So I focus on areas that I can add value. I can add value in my mind with working through troubled governmental units. We have a $52 billion pension system. And if you look at the markets today, typically a public pension fund will have 25 to 40% of their assets in fixed income, which today the interest rates are 2.5%, 3%. And we need to get an 8% return. So we're looking at creative ways to recalibrate the pension fund so that it can continue to fund the retirees in the state. It's funded at about just under 80%. So we need to get this 8% hurdle, or there's going to be a big problem in the state's general fund. So where I see my value add is kind of driving change or coming up with creative ideas. And then I make certain I've got people around me that keep the trains running on time, that make certain that 10 million transactions do get processed. And I learned something just last winter. I was walking in front of the Capitol, and a lobbyist came up and said, hey, I'm trying to get through Treasury to fix the tax bill I've got, and I can't get through. So I go back to the office, and I say, what's about this? And they said, well, we get 200,000 calls a month, and we can only handle about 15,000. So we dig in a little deeper, and I find out 85% of those, 150% of the calls are people calling back because they can't get through the first time. So, all right, really, we got 100,000 calls. Then I find out 85% of the calls are the driver responsibility collection items. So then I said, well, why don't we send that to our private contractor down the road, and that way we'll have 15,000 calls, which we can handle. And I met with a little bit of resistance, but they came back to me and said, this is March. He goes, we can have this moved out by September 1st. I said, I'd be embarrassed to go to the governor and tell him that it's going to take me 6 months to do this. So they went back to the drawing board and got it done by July 1st without a hitch. It's been great. And there was some unease in the department about it. So I go back and check now, and the workers are happier. I mean, if you think about it, if you walked into a situation every day where you knew it was impossible to do your job, but to work through all the volume of stuff that comes in every day, it'd be pretty demoralizing. So then you look and say, Dillon, you sound a little inconsistent because you said you have a good management team there. And what I learned is sometimes when something lingers for so long, even good people don't recognize something's broken. So sometimes it just takes that fresh face to look at something that says, well, let's fix that. So it's a good staff. They're very capable, but they got used to the status quo, and they just needed a nudge, and now they're happy about it. So it taught me that we, in all of our lives, sometimes try to take a second look from a different direction of what you're doing, because sometimes you just don't recognize that the house fell into disrepair, or that your suit's starting to look a little bit older because you wear it so often. So I'm all about taking a fresh look. I do want to spend a little time because I think it's very important for you, because I think there's going to be a macro change. Am I good on time, by the way? Or I don't want to run past. Okay. This is a macro event that's going on that I think is very important for everyone really to understand, but especially you in college. And it's what's going on in Europe, the sovereign debt crisis. There was a book written by Professors Reinhardt and Rogoff, and they say this time it's different. And what basically they're saying is when a country gets 90% debt to GDP, bad things begin to happen. And they went back to 1200 AD and studied every major society that got to the levels of debt that we're at. And it's a bad outcome. The bad outcome is 10 years of very slow growth, more inflation, more recession, and it's just not pretty. Well, why is Europe so acute? Well, because they're worse than us and they've spent more. We're at 90, give or take, % debt to GDP. Greece is 140. Italy's over 100. Portugal's bad. Spain's bad. Ireland's bad. But what's even worse, when Argentina got in this problem several years ago, they defaulted on their debt, but they had their own currency. They could devalue their currency and work their way out of the debt situation. What you have now in Europe is a country like Greece that is caught up in the euro. They don't control their currency, and they really don't produce much. And there's this formula that is an absolute truth. If you're in a situation like this, there's a formula that C plus G minus T has to equal 0. Well, C is consumer debt, G is government debt, T is trade. So if you're Greece and you want to pay down your debt, you have to have a trade surplus. Let's say you pay down consumer debt by $100. You pay down government debt by $100. Then they have to have a trade surplus of $200. Well, what does Greece make? And they don't control their currency, so it's valued too high. They can't export their way out of the problem. So what you're watching happening in Europe now is a real big deal. And I think the next one to watch is Japan. Their debt to GDP is 200%. They have a very aging population, no growth, no kids. Traditionally, their own citizens bought the debt, but now that population's getting older, they need the capital. So Japan's going to have some issues here, and so is our country. We remain the reserve currency of the world, which gives us leverage. We have our own currency. We're a dynamic country. What we see with energy going on now gives me a lot of confidence. With the natural gas prices, this country's dynamic, but we got to be. We got to really be on our game for us to not have this debt to GDP monster really kill growth and the opportunity for my kids and your kids to enjoy the great country that we've grown up in. And my closing remarks will be this, and I've not been good at this, but the most important lesson as you chase through your career is don't ever let whatever you're doing interfere with paying attention to your family. You've got to give them time, and you've got to be close in paying attention to your family. Work will always be there, but the number one, I think, aspect of a good leader is someone who's a good father or mother. So with that, I will close my remarks and be happy to address any questions you might have.
My name is Petra Al-Sufi. I was a leadership fellow. Thank you for your remarks. And my question is, you talked about coming and bringing fresh air or fresh perspective to an organization or group or whatever, which was easy for you to do as the boss. how do we do it as, young people entering the workforce or entering an organization, especially if we're entering an organization that everybody has been there for a long time, and we come with fresh perspective or whatever. How do we do it? What's your advice? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on the environment. That's why I told the story about the 21st Century Jobs Fund, because I just injected myself into it. I asked. I think that example about the call center, if you were a new hire in there and you saw it, maybe there would have been a chance to go to a manager, and maybe that happened 10 times, and the manager just rejected the idea. It'll never happen. No one up top will support it. I just think you have to take some risks in life, and pick a very logical argument so you can defend it if it ever surfaces up, above, to a higher level. But every once in a while you gotta take a risk, and I had that same feeling. I remember I was working at W.R. Grace at the time, and I worked in the retail division, and Wilson Sporting Goods was going bankrupt, and I wanted to go to my manager. We owned Herben's Sporting Goods, and I thought, why don't we have the sporting goods store by Wilson, And I was 22 at the time, and I didn't have the courage to walk down the hall. And I kind of regret I didn't, because what was the downside? And maybe I could have got fired. But you won't learn if you don't take some swings here and there. And it seems risky at the time, but I think you got to measure your managers and all that. But do a little homework before you go. That relentless preparation part should be in there, so that when you go in, you can justify exactly what you're pushing. But I think if there's one mistake I made as a young employee, it was not having the courage enough to try to change things internally. That's my opinion. If you get fired, I'm sorry.
I would like to return to the of the emergent financial manager. I'm sympathetic to the need to intervene, apparently really often, in situations where democratically elected officials are, probably for a variety of reasons, incapable of really addressing their own financial problems. I'm sympathetic to that. My concern is, what do you see as a way back to the democratic process that put those elected officials in place in the first place, assuming that by whatever means are necessary, you actually put the government entity, back on a fairly sound financial standing.
Fair enough, and I'm glad you circled back to this, because what I'm seeing in some of the communities that we go to, even Jack Welch, if given the role of mayor, couldn't fix the problems that are in front of him. It's because of a lot of things. It's the city council, it's civil service, it's union contracts. And think about this, David Bing has 48 different bargaining units that he's got to negotiate with in 6 weeks' time. And then the systems behind that, 65 full-time employees just to process payroll for the police department. When they tried to outsource the payroll to ADP, ADP said, we're not interested, too complicated. Some of these systems are so broken that even the best democratically elected mayor in the world can't fix them. And the ones that we're dealing with typically are ones that are about to miss payroll, or cash is going to run out in a short period of time. So the challenges are monumental. The new kind of view of this, we would add to the law a transition out through a review board. And then you put the mayor back in after you got some of the basic blocking and tackling done. You put the mayor back in, city council's back in, and then you have a financial oversight board that just polices things like, hey, you're not going to spend the city into oblivion again. So they'd have a right maybe to veto a budget or a right to approve a collectively bargain agreement. Some control so that they just don't go right back into the problem again. And that's legislation. We're just proposing the concept because we do want people to know we want to transition out. We don't look to stay there forever. But I think that on the front end of some of these, you need some of those extreme powers to get things heading in a different direction. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Mr. Dillon, I'm John Sampson. I've got a question that you're dealing with financial situations, deals with education. It seems that we're unable to get over the hurdles of different elements in education. And having just finished a book called Surpassing Shanghai, which came out in November, it talks about 5 of the best school systems in the world and how they've, over a period of time, whether it's 50 years or 20 years, have improved the systems for all kids. What role does your office take in relation to some of the educational systems? I know some of the districts are in financial straits right now, but what direction can we go to bring elements together to be successful?
Yeah, as it relates to on the front end of the financial crisis or the assessment if someone's in trouble, that's really under Department of Education. Mike Flanagan was here earlier. His department kind of watches the front end of the school districts. Once they're under for review, it comes into my department. And my view is for schools, we'll focus on the financial engine, but I don't feel like Treasury should engage too much in the educational philosophy of that district per se. So when we just had one, we just appointed a manager into Highland Park Schools. I knew who the manager was going to be, but I engaged him quickly because some decisions have to be made fast about that would affect the academics. So I was making certain he was in the loop along with the governor's office about, all right, academically, where should this district be in September? So I take the view that Treasury's not expert at that and we shouldn't. But then there's that new EAA, which the governor's established, which is kind of a statewide independent school district that will start to take on some of the lowest performing schools and inject some kind of new philosophies into them. And that will begin next September. How many schools they put into it remains an open question. But I can tell you it's a high priority for the governor. It was kind of his baby that's getting a lot of attention internally. It's not a reform without an engine behind it.
Thank you for coming to speak. My name's Austin Dean. You spoke briefly about GDP and the national debt, and I'm wondering, maybe you come back to that or a different issue, but speaking to the youth particularly, is there one thing that maybe you'd like to shake us and say, hey, this is going to be a burden on you, and it's time that you step up and embrace it?
Yeah. Number one, this book, it's called The Endgame by John Malden. I would really encourage you to read it because it's not just about the U.S., it's about how this plays out in virtually the entire world. But we saw a big, it reminded me of Granholm Bishop and Dillon watching, the debt ceiling debate last summer where you have divided government, Republican-controlled House, Democratic-controlled Senate, and kind of people get jaded, right? Well, they can never do something tough in an election year. I don't buy that. We passed energy reform that basically remonopolized utilities 6 weeks before an election, and I grew the majority. So I think we're letting them off the hook. Oh, we'll just wait till after the presidential election, and then they can start to tackle it. Well, all they've done is added another $1 trillion of debt onto the situation because they didn't have the courage to act sooner. That being said, we really got to hold them accountable. When you bump into, and I'll tell you one thing that surprises me, and I didn't know it till I got into this career, is your state reps and your senators and your congressional people are far more accessible than you might think. I mean, a phone call actually gets returned, or they come to events like this. They need to hear. And you guys have a pretty big voice here as, a university saying, you guys, you got to figure this out because you just can't keep, spending the country into oblivion because the consequence will fall, on the tail end of my life, hopefully, but definitely on, the next generation. So it's kind of saying, we're not going to take it anymore. So you got to reach out. You got to be a squeaky wheel. The solutions for the U.S. are not insurmountable, but the longer we wait, the worse they get.
Thank you. I was wondering, I heard Senator Levin say today that they were going to pass a bill so the U.S. congressmen wouldn't be able to do insider trading. How do you hold legislators accountable when they thought all along that something like insider trading was acceptable for themselves and not for the rest of us.
Yeah, I thought there already was laws against that. So, I mean, why don't we just enforce it once we got, that's the typical way legislators are, is I'm going to get this headline because I'm going to put in this new policy. And that's where I think there's something really significant about the governor's State of the State address. He got panned a little bit because he said this is a year of implementation. But government is really good at coming up with a new great idea and then never really implementing it. I would say that about the 21st Century Jobs Fund. It was implemented in a way that just made me pull my hair out because government's not good at implementing. So the governor moved a lot of stuff last year, and now let's actually get government servicing the people better. So I think it falls in that category of it's a nice headline, but has no meaning. And if they were serious about it, they'd call up the SEC and the Justice Department and start prosecuting the people that are doing it now.